Okay, we are resuming public session. We have concluded executive session with nothing to report. At this time, we will rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, led by Trustee Barrett.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. Just a reminder of the emergency exits immediately to my right and to the audience left, also to the back of the room. Just a reminder, in the event of emergency, please leave in an orderly fashion through these exits. This is a smoke-free district, and smoking is not permitted in the building or anywhere on the school grounds. This is also a hate-free and a bully-free school district. Welcome to the, again, to the meeting of the January 31st business meeting of the South Country Central School District. And with that, we will hear from the superintendent on the board consent agenda, item C. Mr. Superintendent?
Thank you, President Felice. The administration recommends approval of board consent items reflected in Schedules C1 through C3.
Okay. We need a motion and a second for item C1 through C3. Motion by Vice President Hayes, seconded by Trustee Barry. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please raise your hands. See, no, are you raising all hands? Okay. Okay. We have 4 hands raised. Okay. 4 in favor. Any opposed? 1 opposed. 2 opposed. Okay. Seeing 4 in favor, 2 opposed, the motion carries by majority. Okay. With that, I'd like to report that the board is happy to report that we have extended the superintendent's contract by 2 years. Congratulations, Mr. Superintendent. We are very happy on the work that you're doing, and we look forward to another 2 years of your service with us.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for the support. And like I said, I've always felt like I belonged here, and the work is far from being complete. And I pledge to do my due diligence to continue working hard for the benefit of this entire learning community. So thank you.
Thank you. And with that, it brings us up to communication and announcements for the superintendent's report.
All right, thank you. Board of Education, I'll read through our first slide, which again is a reminder of our snow delay policies. Typically, we would like to make the calls as early as possible, just as a matter of convenience for our community and our staff. Besides our robocall that goes out and robo email that goes out, you can check the following radio stations for updates on school closings. And just as a quick reminder, when a snow day is called, all buildings, including the YMCA before and after school programs at South Haven and the YMCA, will be canceled for the day, as well as our district office. Delayed opening means that our schedules start 2 hours after their traditional start times. However, our before school program at South Haven, which is hosted by the YMCA, is canceled on those mornings. And early dismissal is sort of a rare occurrence, but that typically means that the high school dismisses 30 minutes early, Franklin Long 15 minutes early, and the elementary schools their typical regular time. That's something we try not to practice, but typically we've had 1 delayed opening this year, and it's my hope that we don't have any snow days. With that said, regardless, snow days should be snow days. We do have a remote instruction plan in the event we start using numerous slow days so that we don't lose our instructional days and have an adverse effect in later vacations. Next, winter concerts were still going on since our last meeting. We were scheduled to meet last week, but since then I was able to have the pleasure to attend 2 concerts at Brookhaven Elementary School. Big shout out to Mr. Kasi and Miss Adi for her piano accompaniment. The kids were fantastic. They did songs in both English and Spanish, consistent with the dual language program. One of the songs was called El Coqui, which is the frog, or the traditional frog in Puerto Rico. Was entirely too cute, especially watching the students play instruments on their own. It was pretty amazing. That was followed by our last winter concert at Frank P. Long, which was also fantastic. I'm always impressed at the sheer number of students who participate in our music programs. And one of the things that really stood out to me about this concert was our chorus actually sang a song using American Sign Language, which was pretty cool to behold and witness. So a big shout out to Mr. Giamona, Mr. Romano, Mr. Rouse, and of course Ms. Victoria Hartman, who is our music department chair. This past week, I had the pleasure of attending our first ever girls wrestling tournament, which is pretty fantastic. Actually, our district clerk, President Felice, had the pleasure of joining me on that trip. So big shout out to Coach Margiolio and his daughter, Caitlin, for placing 4th in our state wrestling tournament. Our girls exhibited a great talent. It was a great sort of event to behold. You know, we're hopeful that the program will grow. It really is expanding in other school districts, and next year we'll have our first set of actually true girls competitions. But it was actually a pretty fun event to attend. We also hosted our first Compass Unity meeting here. For those who are not familiar, Compass Unity is basically an organization that really speaks to drug awareness and drug and substance use prevention. I want to give a big shout out to Ms. Tisha Robinson for organizing the meeting and bringing different organizations together, like the Suffolk County Police, the EOC, Family Service League, some representation from our faith-based organizations, like the Journeys Church, for their participation as well. We had great discussions, and this sort of endeavor is funded by a grant, the Drug-Free Schools, the Drug-Free Communities Grant, which was extended for this year, and we're applying for another 5-year extension to continue this good work. Really good time, so I'm really appreciative of Ms. Robinson's efforts. I also got to attend the Bellport Middle School Curriculum Fair last night. I wish there were more parents in attendance. However, the program was great. Teachers shared basically curriculum snapshots from the core curriculum areas. That's ELA, science, math, and social studies. So big shout out to all of the teachers who participated in last night's curriculum fair. And for the great work the middle school teachers are doing at the middle school to help support instruction. Outside of the district, we had one of our team members receive a nice accolade. Dan Maresca, who is in charge of our IT department, was awarded the Bright Light Award by ASSET. ASSET stands for the Association of School Supervisors of Educational Technology. And you know, IT, and Vinny's sitting here in the back, people kind of go unnoticed until something goes wrong. But the amount of work that they're responsible for in terms of keeping our infrastructure running is pretty monumental, especially in this digital age. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Dan Maresca for his work, and for Ms. Krista Albright, who's really hit the ground running here in South Country as our Director of Instructional Technology. I also had the privilege of, we talked about Compass Unity already. I also had the privilege of attending the Nassau County, or the Nassau Suffolk School Boards Association, and NSBA advocacy dinner in conjunction with the Suffolk County School Superintendent Association and the Nassau County Council of School Superintendents. Basically, we talked about advocacy and sort of kind of combining our efforts through our school boards and superintendents and school districts in the effort to best support our school districts. The event was really informative. There was a really wonderful and powerful presentation by Lars Clemenson. He is the superintendent of Hampton Bays, which featured some of his English language learners and sharing their immigration stories, which were really powerful. But it was a great sort of lens to put on that experience and how we best support those children. And also I have to give a shout out to Island Harvest and Randy Shubin-Dresner, because I know Trustee Barry has a connection to her. But we learned how Island Harvest does a lot more than just supply food pantries. So we're really lucky to have organizations like that on the island. But ultimately, the message was, one island, one voice, and we all sort of collectively work to advocate for our respective learning community. Along those lines, I also had the privilege of attending an advocacy breakfast through the Suffolk County School Superintendents Association, which featured Assemblyman Fred W. Thiel. And we talked about various things, again, in terms of advocating for our schools and learning. including some of the legislative priorities that we spoke about through NISBA and through our associations. But if I could sort of summarize what we've discussed or what the priorities are, it's basically the full restoration of the Safe Harmless formula for foundation aid, guaranteed minimum increases for school districts on Safe Harmless, change back to the inflationary index factor to be the last 12 months of our consumer price index, or CPI, and not the 10-year average that was featured in the governor's budget, because when you use a 10-year average, it kind of skews the numbers. Fulfill the promise of full funding for foundation aid for districts who are due funds, and of course, really lobbying the state ed department to do a comprehensive study of reforming the foundation aid formula. So this comes from both NISBA and our Association of Superintendents, and it's going to be continual work, especially considering the release of the governor's budget and some of the conversation that's sort of sparked, which I'll touch upon in our budget presentation that's going to come up in a few minutes. And finally, this weekend, Longwood School District is hosting a legislative breakfast. I will not be able to attend. I have a very good reason for not attending. I'll be joining our high school's outdoor club on a ski trip to Butternut up near Great Barrington, Massachusetts. But our business official, Jennifer Segee, will be there to sort of see what she can glean from the experience and see what the legislators or advocacy efforts are going to sort of look like in the next coming months. So I want to thank Ms. Segee for making herself available, and I'll be sure to report back to the board on my experience with the high school students, including our board officio, Ms. Brent Johnson. Finally, there's many ways to keep in touch with happenings. There's a community portal which you can subscribe to and receive district level emails. We have our new social media link that gives us, gives the community all of our social media handles, which are various and a great way to keep in touch. And there's a Superintendent's Corner, which features a monthly entry, access to my contact information, my weekly update, and all my social media pages that really feature some South Country happenings. And that concludes my superintendent report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, that brings us up to the trustees and advisory committee reports. So we'll start with trustee Flippin. Nothing to report? Trustee Pacini?
Not a whole lot. We did have a Nassau Suffolk School Board meeting, but it was obviously about, most of the discussions were about the school aid, and the school aid runs have come out, so I think we'll discuss that as we go through the budget process and see how that plays out. One of the interesting things, though, because the superintendent brought up Lars Clemenson from Hampton Bays, that I learned at that meeting was Hampton Bays High School, or Teachers Federal Credit Union, has just opened a branch inside of Hampton Bays High School, and the branch is run completely by students. And I found that to be really interesting, and you're starting to see trends, and we hear people talk about how do we teach students in high school financial literacy and things like that, on personal finances, et cetera, and I thought that was a really unique program, and I'd be curious to see how it pans out. But those are the types of things that are happening in education I think are transformational to some extent. And I know these things come up, and it's only one district out of 64 in Suffolk County, but I would hope that we can be in the mix on some ideas like that can further our high school experience for our students. So I thought that was worth mentioning, that was unique.
No, it's fantastic. I'm familiar with the program, and I think one of the focuses, again, and when you look at the Blue Ribbon Commission studies, is how do we make education more practical? And there's a lot of life skills that I think that we omit. We have the traditional sort of curriculums, and when we talk about ELA or math or science, but what I mean by life skills is financial literacy is extremely important. Even things like understanding, and this is part of financial literacy, is understanding interest rates. Even if you live in a suburban area, how do you take care of your house? Things you need to be aware of. Things that are more practical for navigating what young people call adulting. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Trustee Barry?
No report at this time.
Trustee Trent?
No, nothing to add.
Vice President Hayes?
I too went to the curriculum fair and I learned a lot. And I particularly liked seeing the PowerPoint presentation that they had that showed the different topics that are covered in the different subject matters. It showed the math and the developing math and how it goes from grade level to grade levels. I thought that was a terrific presentation. And I also attended 2 webinars, one by New York State School Board Association, which was on social media for board members. And the other webinar was by I'm not gonna get the title correct, but it's the League of Conservation Voters with regard to electric school buses. And it was interesting to me because they covered not just the environmental impact of current diesel buses and gasoline-powered buses and the impact of an electric school bus, but they went into great detail about the difficulties with the electric school buses in terms of less distance per battery during winter months, and the need for recharging, and the length of time it takes to recharge, and the fact that a lot of the funds that are available would only cover up to 10 buses for school district. So there are a whole lot of issues, and I do know from going to different Nassau's New York State School Board Association webinars and meetings that this is something that the lobbyists through the School Boards Association is dealing with because of need for support in order to implement the requirement about electric school buses and the need for financing. So I'm
Yeah, if I could
glad
add to
we've
that,
got the
yeah.
support of the State School Boards Association to do that.
So that was brought up at the National Suffolk meetings, it does too, I can't remember who the representative was from the superintendents this year, but that's another thing, especially talk about school financing, that's got a lot of concern among superintendents and school board associations. There are some grants out there right now for some buses, and it covers a portion of the bus, but not the whole bus, so now you're gonna be buying buses when you might not need one, if that's the case. But we're also starting to see a lot of protests and a lot of, from community groups about these battery storage facilities and how these batteries are handled, and should they be next to schools? And these grants for the buses do nothing to address the infrastructure that's gonna be needed to charge, store, and what's gonna happen with the electrical grid and everything else. And the outcome is predicted to be catastrophic to some schools. I think I brought up South Huntington was one school district, they own 60 buses on their own. So even if they got it at a reduced rate, I forget what the grant is, I think the buses average $450,000 a year, I think there's $300 grants out there. $150,000 a bus to change 60 buses is still a lot more money than the school district can just pull out of their back pocket. So I think, you know, this clearly wasn't thought out, I don't think, by the governor. And there's a lot of pushback from the legislature on this and some lobbying groups. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Does that conclude your report?
It does.
Okay. And then I would just report that I enjoyed the events that the superintendent already spoke about. And on Friday, I will be attending a virtual lobbying day, Albany Lobbying Day, through NYSBA, New York State School Board Association, on probably virtually everything we're speaking about, budgeting, financing, but it's about 3.5, I think it's a 3.5 hour virtual lobbying day, so we'll report on that the next meeting, and that'll be Friday morning. So I'm just gonna throw this out to the board, since the only major presentation we have tonight is the budget presentation. Would the board be interested in taking the budget out of order? We'll go through the rest of our consent agenda, leaving just the budget till the end, and then that'll be our last order of business.
It's fine with me.
Does that sound good? And then we'll get all the other business out of the way, and let's leave the
You
budget
do
till
it-
last?
Yeah, you wanna do the business now, you're saying, and then do
Yeah,
budget
we'll do
last?
we'll do
Are we
the
gonna
rest of it.
omnibus the,
Well, no, we won't omnibus it, we'll just go, we'll do it quickly. And then we'll just leave the we'll leave the board, we'll leave the budget till the end. But, Chris, do we have any cards?
No.
Okay. But we'll leave an opportunity for the public to speak after the budget, should any questions come up. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. There's no public commentary at this point, right? Okay. We're gonna hold item F. We're going to ask for your approval of G first. G1, go ahead.
All right, the administration recommends approval of curriculum items reflected in schedules G1 and G3.
Okay, need a motion and a second for G1 through G3. Trustee Trent, this side, anybody?
Here, I can.
Anybody? Okay. Trustee Barry, any discussion? No discussion? All those in favor? Seeing all hands raised, item G1 through G3 is approved unanimously. Item H,
The administration recommends approval of personnel changes reflected in schedules H1 through H7.
okay, again, motion and second. Motion by Trustee Barry, seconded by Trustee Trent. Any discussion? No discussion? All those in favor? Seeing all hands raised, H1 through H7 is approved unanimously. And item I.
The administration recommends approval of business items reflected in schedules I1 through I8.
And again, motion and a second. Trustee Barry, Trustee Trent. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please raise your hands. Seeing all hands raised, item I1 through I8 is approved unanimously. And that concludes the business and consent agenda items of the meetings, and that will bring us back to the,
Budget.
where am I?
F.
F, thank you. F, item for discussion and action, the budget presentation, long and review, and long-term planning.
Thank you, President Felice. This is
Okay.
the moment everybody's been waiting for.
Yes.
All right. Yes. All right, thank you, trustees. So we'll get to it. This is the first of a few budget presentations that we will be hosting. You know, the process is somewhat long. It runs through April. But just to review, oops. Sorry. Just to review the schedule and the timeline, so the budget process is sort of a long process, and, you know, especially after the release of the governor's proposal, there's a lot of questions that immediately come to mind, but we have to trust the process, because there's a lot of questions we can't answer at this point, because we have to go through the budgetary process. Today, we're going to be talking about the budget process itself and long-term planning. Next week, we'll talk about the tax cap and our revenue overview, and that's what we're really talking more in specificity about the impact of the foundation aid cuts and what that means in terms of our revenue, followed by the codes 1,000, 5,000, 9,000 codes, curriculum instruction at the beginning of March, which leads to staffing, which leads to expenses and revenues update. Typically, this is done because, in theory, the governor's final budget is supposed to be released on April 1st. So we have our fingers crossed that that will happen to, you know, allow for ample time for us to really plan. And then the budget adaptation, which is scheduled for April 17th. This is followed by our budget hearing, which is scheduled for May 8th. And our budget vote and board election will be hosted on May 24th. It seems like a little far away, 21st, thank you, Trustee Barry. But just in terms of the way the passage of time has been going this year, I feel like it's right around the corner. In terms of like looking at the timeline internally, you know, November, December, we already started conversations with administrations with regard to some of the nuts and bolts of the budgetary process, which includes procedures, considerations, and identification of program needs. These are really initial conversations that we had with our administrative team. In December, we start focusing on meeting with our administrators, including their initial budget submissions, using our financial software. I want to thank Ms. Zaki, our business official, for really making the process a lot more efficient and utilizing technology to a greater degree, because it made the process a lot better. Now, a lot of these budget submissions are very preliminary because, for example, in secondary schools, we have to wait till student requests come in for like courses and stuff to really get an idea of the staffing we'll need. But it gives us an idea of the direction that we're moving in. In January, we started building departmental budgets, our staffing tables, and newer special program requests are to be discussed. Discuss in more detail what that means in a later slide. February is when we start counting our FTEs, or full-time equivalents, which are due to our district office, and meetings are held again with the administration to discuss initial staffing and program requests. And I kind of emphasize the wants versus needs, because again, we have to discuss exactly first, bless you, we have to discuss what we actually need, and then we have to kind of do wish lists and see what we can make happen. In March, the staffing requests are verified through projected enrollment. That's at the elementary, in large part, bless you, at the middle school, and through course requests. Again, we do individualized scheduling at the high school level, so our staffing really is dependent on what students want to sort of learn in the courses that they're registered for. In April, the school budget is finalized, presented to the BOE, with the Board of Trustees, and adopted, again, which leads to the May budget vote and hearing, which again is scheduled for May 21st. Right now, we're in January, so we've been building departmental budgets. We've had those meetings. We've had initial staffing tables submitted by our administrators, and we've discussed the potential for program requests with our respective stakeholders. In terms of our administrative considerations, obviously we discuss or we consider our board priorities. The most important priority that applies to this process is to develop a fiscally responsible and transparent budget, maximizing efficiency and economy, ensuring the district is using its resources to deliver the best educational program, and meeting our long-term or long-range planning goals. We also appreciate the public schools that are funded in large part by taxpayer dollars. I believe the sort of share of the taxpayers is about 46% in South Country. So we appreciate that when we make decisions with regards to our budgeting process. We establish a budget as precisely as possible, also allowing for unforeseen contingencies. We collaborate with stakeholders, distinguish between, again, the wants and needs of the district to ensure that we label each as such. We appreciate both the short-term and long-term costs associated with programs and staffing. And we always increase our focus on decreasing expenditures while increasing revenues. And what I mean by increasing revenues, it's grant opportunities that are out there. We certainly do our due diligence to see what revenue is required throughout the course of the year. And again, this is through advocacy that I spoke a little bit about before with our elected officials, donations, grants, etc. And finally, through transparent budgeting, earn the confidence of the Board of Education and obviously the trust of the community, which is something we strive for during each budgetary process. In terms of the resources we use, there's different. We use our internal auditors, Narosky and Smith, external auditors, Cullen and Danowski. We have financial advisors, which are still fiscal advisors in marketing, to troubleshoot ideas from. Obviously, we have different organizations that we are members of. Myself, I'm a member of NISCUS, which is New York State Council of School Superintendents, the Suffolk County Council of School Superintendents, Eastern Suffolk BOCES. Our business official, Ms. Agee, deals with ASBO, which is the Assistant Superintendents and Business Officials Association. Eastern Suffolk BOCES, again, stakeholder input, community input, and of course technology and software to help with the mathematical projections. So again, the point of this is that we sort of use sort of a whole sorts of resources in making our decisions. We do not work in a vacuum. And I apologize for the manner in which the slides are populating something up with the keyboard. But in terms of the budget strategies, there's a rollover budget, which we don't practice. That's typically when you take the prior year's budget and you just roll it over and you make adjustments based on fixed costs. There are certain fixed costs that we have no control over, fuel, insurance costs, those types of entitlements that basically are fixed and we know nothing about. Those costs kind of get rolled over. Zero-based budgeting, which we do in large part, is basically we build a budget based on the needs of the district and on your wish list, and you try to figure out ways to make them happen. And you do that through just the justification of expenditures. You look at actuals versus budgeted versus actuals. But the point of zero-based budgeting is that we don't work backwards from a certain number. We actually build our budget on what our district needs. And then we prioritize. Once we know what our needs are and our wants are and our wish lists are, then we need to start prioritizing those things. And we lay out our recommendations in terms of cost to reach our objectives. One of the things I love to emphasize is that our budget should match our goals. And if we're gonna work on student achievement, then certainly we should speak to that in our budget, and that's something we also will work towards and strive for. Part of the process also is to gather information, look at our revenue and expenditures, again, actuals versus budgeted, our program needs, again, it's staffing, equipment, supplies, revenues, expenditures, we calculate the tax levy, we'll be doing that towards the end of the process, although the tax cap is calculated before that. And we consult. And again, none of this is done in a vacuum. I have a couple of workshops even scheduled for superintendents, or financial budgeting workshops. And especially in light of, the recent news with the governor's proposed budget, it's imperative that we really use our resources to develop a budget in a very mindful manner. And again, at the end, we propose the budget to the Board of Trustees. And that happens in April when we adopt the budget. This is just a review of our current school budget. Our tax levy for the current school budget was 2.75%. The miscellaneous revenue that you see displayed represents, and it includes but not limited to, our day school tuition, health services, interest and earnings, Medicaid reimbursements, electronic rates, we get some revenue from that, rental income, and of course donations. Our federal funds, you notice, are not a part of this budget because they're not sustainable and they were meant to expire this year. So as a correction, last year we removed those federal funds from our revenue to have a more accurate picture of what our revenue stream will be for the current school year. We still have federal funds available to us in this current school year that we'll use to offset expenditures in the end, but we made that correction last year to ensure that our revenue represented revenue that's ongoing and will be here for the foreseeable future. And then reserves. School districts are allowed to use reserves to offset expenditures. And again, the plan is to use them and replenish them at the end of the year to make sure you keep healthy balances in each of your respective reserves. Expenditures basically represent the maximum amount that can be utilized to operate the school district. So we want to make sure that our budget for this current school year is $140 million, and that's basically the maximum we can spend to operate the school budget. The idea is you do efficient sort of budgeting, and you don't sort of be mindful of your expenditures, because the idea is you do want to have some sort of fund balance at the end of the school year. You certainly don't want to expend the maximum amounts in each of the respective budget codes, but you have to allow for contingencies. So here are the challenges that we sort of have to face. First, inflation and the tax cap calculation. You heard me mention how even in the foundation aid formula, they use a 10-year average with the consumer price index. And sometimes the tax cap, which people sort of think of as a 2% tax cap, which isn't really accurate. It's based on an 8-point formula that we'll talk about next week. But that's kind of a challenge to school districts when there is a cap on the revenues you can raise, because we have no control over inflation and rising costs. Another challenge is the federal grants period end date, which we anticipated. This is the last year we have those federal funds. We already planned for that in this current year's budget. We certainly are planning for that moving forward. This challenge basically evaporates after this year. The next challenge we faced was the differential in building aid or state aid and bond payments. This challenge will exist for the next 4 years. This was the first year of that discrepancy, which we anticipated, and we planned for it in our budgetary planning. What's new this year is basically the decrease in foundation aid. So when we look at decreases in aid, we really focus on the foundation aid. That's really the important number that we sort of work with. Our actual decrease, based on the current and initial governor's proposal, was a decrease of $676,000, which represents about a 1.65% decrease in our foundation aid. One of the things that keeps getting emphasized that we're at the very beginnings of the process. Certainly as we move forward, we plan for such a cut, but it is our expectation that that number will be modified throughout the budgetary process, and certainly before legislators approach the deadline for the submission of the final state budget, which hopefully will occur on April 1st. But this is our starting point, and this is what we're working with. And we'll certainly keep the trustees posted, and we'll continue our advocacy efforts moving forward. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about the foundation aid at next week's presentation when we talk about revenue. In terms of our district reserves utilization, we have an assigned fund balance. That's basically the amount of our budget that's basically appropriated to partially fund the subsequent year's budget. We typically use $4 million to do that. That's allowable by the state. The unassigned fund balance is just basically an amount of money or a sum of money that we're allowed to keep in our funds or our bank account, to make it, in layman's terms, which is capped at 4%. We can never have more than a 4% unassigned fund balance in our bank accounts. To give you a little perspective, some school districts are hurt by this figure because 4% sometimes isn't sufficient. The state budget, for example, has about a 15% unassigned fund balance. So for smaller school districts and smaller budgets, sometimes that 4% presents a challenge, and that's where you hear some school districts advocating for increasing that cap. But currently is at 4%. Our reserve funds are basically sums of money within our general fund that are established to be used for specific purposes. We have 5 reserve funds. We have a capital reserve fund, what's called EMBLAR. I always say it wrong, but that's Employee Benefits Accrued Liability Reserve Fund, our Retirement Contribution Reserve Fund, and our Unemployment and Workers' Compensation. The use of those funds are restricted by the state, and there are certain guidelines on how you can use those funds. They're usually used to sort of address specific expenses. For example, you can use a reserve, an unemployment reserve, to deal with unemployment insurance expenses, but nothing other than that. In terms of our reserves, this is a 5-year sort of trend of our reserves. Right now, we're considered to have healthy reserves. If you see the balance in 2019, it was about $24 million. It's currently $34 million. And those are the respective balances of each of our reserves, including the balance in our assigned fund balance, which is used to offset expenditures for this year, and our unassigned fund balance, which is basically the maximum we can keep in our general funds at the 4%. And that's why that number really doesn't deviate a lot. It's always going to be about that number as long as we keep it at 4%, which is we're mandated to do. To give you more insights into our reserves, this sort of chart demonstrates which reserves are partially funded or fully funded, and how we plan to use them to offset expenses in our revenue side of our budget. And again, the idea is you use reserves to offset those specific expenses, and then you replenish them at the end of the year with your fund balances. So those were the ending balances as of June 30th of this past school year. And to give you some context, a fully funded reserve indicates that it's consistent with guidelines. It's usually or typically based on percentages, where we reach sort of maximum capacity. And each of the reserves have a different sort of guideline for what's considered fully funded. Partially funded means that we haven't reached that capacity. So for example, you see that 3 out of the 5 reserves are fully funded, which means they're at healthy spots. There's still a little room for growth for 2 out of the 5. Our capital reserve is a little different. We just established a new capital reserve to be topped off at $10 million over an 8-year span. And every time we have a capital reserve vote, that number goes down because the use of the capital reserves actually requires voter approval. The one benefit of using capital reserves is that capital projects generate building aid. So the idea is you build up your capital reserves, and then you propose propositions, and you let the voters decide whether or not they approve these propositions to make improvements in our buildings, which our buildings need, but again, also generates revenue for the school district. And at the end of the budgeting process, at the end of the school year, we're required to share with the Board of Trustees our reserve plan for the subsequent year. But this is basically was our plan for the current year. That's where we're at in terms of our reserves, and we're in a good spot when it comes to reserves. When we look at long-term planning, this was our 5-year projection that we shared at the end of the budget process last year, and I just want to explain how it works. When you do a budget presentation, you make assumptions, and you assume things stay status quo, and you take that sort of assumption and you project it out 5 years. This again is a tool that's forever changing, and each 5-year projections will be different year to year. Some of the assumptions we used to generate this projection were one based on the forecast and the data we had at the time we adopted the budget, which again is subject to change. Projections were also based on an assumed average 2.5 tax levy, for example, moving forward through the year 2028. This year, the tax levy was 275. Assuming things would stay status quo in terms of the way the trends were with our state aid, we made the assumption that our tax levy would be 2.75 moving forward. We also projected that our state aid would increase about 1% annually. On average, we've been receiving a little over 3% increases in state aid. We figured it would drop. We thought a conservative number was 1% increase, but as we've seen already by the governor's proposal, it represents a 1.6 decrease. So we'll see how that plays out, and obviously at the end of this budgeting year, this projection will look different. And finally, that if capital reserves are used, again, the capital reserve balances will diminish by the amount that's approved by the voters. And I want to emphasize that through budgetary process, again, this will also change based on trends. And again, one of the things we explained last year, if you look at the year 2027, it seems that you have like an operating deficit, but this is a projection, and the idea is you plan for it. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so if we kept things status quo moving forward 5 years, we may encounter that sort of challenge in that year. If you notice in the subsequent year, it changes because in 2027 is when our debt payments stop. And so that sort of expenditure will be gone. So we're looking forward to that happening. But again, we're going to keep planning accordingly, and we'll have a new 5-year projection at the end of this process based on current information. And that's basically our long-term planning. It's basically about using, sort of being mindful of our expenditures, making comparisons between actuals and budgeted. I want to emphasize that the school budget is a tool. It doesn't represent the actual money that's spent in those respective budget codes, which we'll talk about in future presentations. Our next presentation is scheduled for next Wednesday, which covers our tax cap, which is again based on an 8-point formula, and an overview of our revenue, which will include more of a detailed explanation of our foundation aid and the impact that has, followed by the rest of our budget presentations, which ultimately leads to our budget vote and election on May 21st. And so that concludes our first budget presentation, and I welcome the trustees if you have any questions or comments. Yes, trustee.
2 quick questions. So in regards to the foundation aid formula, and I know this is difficult, I have a hard time completely understanding it, but if I understand correctly, the issue was how the formula was recalculated using an average of the inflation rate over the last 10 years. Do we know if that's accurate?
So I don't want to speak out of speculation. That's my understanding of it. They took a
Okay.
10-year average, and so when you take a 10, and they dropped the highest and lowest year, apparently.
Yeah, so, and the reason I ask the question, public needs to understand that, right? So why is they just giving us less? Well, they just changed the formula that creates the foundation aid, and they use some fugazi math here by using it. I mean, so basically, they didn't use what inflation is now to calculate the increases. And we know that if anything is hurting families and businesses and everybody today, it is inflation. So the fact that the state made a conscious effort to not use real inflation numbers for what's happening today and cost averaged over 10 years, when we can't go back 10 years to get that money to pay for today's expenses, is I think that's the crux of the issue of what's happening in Albany, and I think that's why school leaders are crying out and rallying against the governor's proposal for aid. But I want to make that clear, and I think that's a talking point that needs to be, like, people don't understand this stuff, they just hear, because part 2 of the question now is, because people hear the governor say, well, the total percentage or dollar amount in reserves of districts across the state is this money, and they say, well, they can go into their reserves, but we really can't, because correct me if I'm wrong, there was no ease of restrictions for what we can use undesignated fund balance for, correct?
That's correct. And so another piece of it too is, I think there's kind of a misconception that school districts have like a surplus of money in reserves. And again, when you look at the private sector or even the state budget, it carries a 15% sort of unassigned fund balance compared to our 4% cap. It sort of speaks volumes.
I just think, as we budget and we do roadshows and we have conversations, those are 2, I think, very important points that I think if they're simplified, the public can understand it and understand what we're up against. Because, doing this, 12, 13 times now, it's like the comments coming out of Albany are from politicians and not people really doing the work who are impacted by what's happening. And they're just they're putting out a narrative that is not accurate. But when they put that narrative out, and because it's covered so poorly in local media, specifically Newsday, and the poor job they do covering education, it makes us all look bad. And I think it's important for the public to know we're not out to get them. The state has really kind of handcuffed us a little bit in what we can do. And I know everybody feels comfortable that this isn't where we're gonna land, but if you wanna get to zero, you start below zero. And that's the fear right now amongst education leaders is, great, it's gonna get better, but zero isn't much better. And for districts like Wood Melville and things like that, and it's,
Some districts got hit really hard, and again, the cautionary sort of tale that we were told, the superintendent, is the work is not done. Let's not rest on our laurels and thinking that, this will change. We still have to be advocates. Another thing that's kind of misleading to the public is this whole idea that across the island, enrollment's down in school districts. And while that may be true in some school districts, student needs have increased. The cost that, it takes to really support our students has increased, and for various reasons. So you can't sort of just use enrollment as sort of like this blanketed measure of, what the school district needs. Because the world has changed. And when we talk about security needs, cybersecurity, mental health, growing population of English language learners, which we welcome to our communities, but represents added costs, enrollment alone is not like a good measure of really developing.
and much of that added cost is mandated. So it's not even like we have a choice. So people understand that the state has the ability to say, we're gonna give you less money, but we're gonna tell you you have to do more with less. And that's what constantly happens, and as you get into it, and because when you see years like this, people start arguing, and it's becoming a political hot button again, it's gonna be interesting how it goes. And I think we need to make sure on our road shows and our talking points and our literature, we have to be talking about those things to simplify it, because we're not the bad guys, so.
So, with respect to the items that you identified that we're preparing for, as we go back to the differential in the building state aid and the bond payments, that we're preparing for that. The other issue that I'm also aware of is that there's like you said, there's many things going on in a district that change. And for example, we're due for our state audit. We audit ourselves. We do our internal audits. We do our external audits, and we make sure that we are in compliance with what is required. So we are subject to our New York State Controller's Office audit every 5 years, and we're pretty close to being due for that, are we not?
I believe so.
This year, probably?
I haven't gotten word yet, but.
But we're probably close. So that'll be happening at the same time. So depending upon, what is looked at there, it may or may not affect our budget at the, as well. So we've got to be prepared for everything, in other words.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So a lot could happen this year, and, with respect to the items that Trustee Pacini raises, and our political advocacy, our legislative advocacy, there's a lot of partisanship involved in that we do have to be prepared for. A lot's going to be said that isn't necessarily accurate, that it's being said for political expediency. And so we do have to be accurate in how we advocate on behalf of our district. And I would caution the residents out there to not react and listen before we react. And this is where we work in partnership with our BTA unions, with our CSEA unions, because we all have to advocate, from the same pot to get for our district, to get for our students, to get for our workers. And we all benefit by advocating in the same way. But it's going to be a tricky year. It's definitely going to be a very tricky year. And we really can't be fighting against each other, including, all of us, residents, board members, frontline workers, all of us. This is going to be a very interesting year. And it's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate when you see elected officials trying to gain political points by attacking one another, depending upon, which political party they're from. It's very unfortunate when you start to see that happen, because nobody gains in that respect.
That's a great point, and I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, I would respectfully disagree a little bit with what it is that you're saying there. Is not that there are definite shots fired with this statement by the governor, you know, in setting the stage at this piece, that, you know, it is going to take a lot of action in that time to change it for our district, let alone other districts as well. And, you know, there is a definite statement being made against public education.
I mean, I tend to agree somewhat in the sense that I think partisan politics has no place in education. Unfortunately, it gets kicked back and forth between both parties, and I don't care who you vote for or how you are. It is a political football, and, you know, it always is. What scares me and what really bothers me about the governor right now, if you take the funding out of it, I mean, you know, the whole reading initiative is again, politicians telling teachers how to teach. And I think teachers in the room feel when they hear, remember all too well about the reform agenda and Common Core and testing and things like that. And whether it was right or wrong, it was rolled out poorly. And that's my concern too on top of that, because that adds funding, it adds stress and anxiety on educators who know how to teach kids how to read, but they shouldn't be told by a politician how to do it. And that's my problem, and we talk about it too when you think, I don't know if we mentioned it exactly, but we talk about how, you know, there's not a one-size-fits-all plan for education. So when somebody says, you know, we spend too much money on per student, right, to your point, well, the needs of students have changed, but I'm pretty sure Albany doesn't know what they are. And I hate to say it, but it really is the truth. And because politics say it, because I've sat in the room and listened to the Commissioner of Education, and it's clear that politics rules that position as well. And that's unfortunate, because she's supposed to be an educator, and right now, it's not what's going on. So that's a little frustrating.
I'll say this in response to everybody's comment, you know, and we talk about it a lot among superintendents. We serve our communities. We are nonpartisan. We don't pick sides. We're here to support our learners. We don't care where you end up in the political spectrum. It's about kids, it's about learning, it's about supporting our staff. And so we're very careful not to engage in those sort of debates. We're gonna advocate for our schools. We're gonna advocate for proper funding. We're gonna advocate for the proper funding of mandates. And how we get there, you know, again, in terms of individuals and community members, you know, I have no jurisdiction about that, but at least from school officials, you know, we have very explicit conversations about the fact that we serve our entire community, regardless of what your belief system is, the political party you're in. We're here to service all our kids and all our learners. And we're advocating just so that schools get properly funded. And sometimes it's unfair to put an extra burden on taxpayers, you know, because, you know, again, you know, people work hard, and that's a really bone of contention, which I think is valid. And so, you know, if the state's, you know, to Trustee Spatini's point, is going to make mandates or require school districts to do certain things, then they should provide the proper funding for it, and not have that sort of, the brunt of that responsibility fall on taxpayers.
Okay. Any other comments for the superintendent with respect to his presentation? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Police, and thank you for your comments.
All right. That brings us back to item J, public commentary. Still no cards? Anybody from the audience wish to comment? Okay. That brings us to closing remarks by board members. Anybody wish to have any final statements?
Yeah. You going around the room?
What's that?
Are you starting one way or just anybody?
Anybody?
I just want to congratulate the superintendent on his extension. I'm happy to have you for a little bit of extra time, hopefully many more years after that. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm hoping to finish out my career here. It's a wonderful place to work and serve.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'll second what Trustee Pacini said.
Appreciate that. Trustee Hayes?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we have a lot to be proud of here in the district, and we have a long way to go. There's many, there are, you know, there's certainly a lot to be grateful for here in South Country, and you certainly have brought us a lot of hope.
Yeah, and really that hope comes from our teachers and from all of our stakeholders in the school district. You know, I'm sort of just trying to sort of provide support in my leadership capacity. You know, there's so much more work that needs to be done. You know, just given my personality, it's, you know, I'm never going to be satisfied. You know, there will be the day where I say it's time to sort of pass the baton to someone else. But I think that, you know, hopefully that day is sort of not in the foreseeable future somewhere, not in the near future, because I really have really great expectations for the school district. I'm certainly going to be looking and working with Beth Doyle and just to really hone in on student achievement, because we certainly have to work on that, and just sort of like bringing not just the respect, but the sort of the clout our district should have, because there are a lot of great things happening. This is a great community. I appreciate our diversity. It's not that, you know, it's not so common on Long Island, especially to have such a great school district. We're diverse just in terms of kids' backgrounds, or, you know, it's across the whole spectrum, and I feel very fortunate to be here. So I appreciate your vote of confidence, and I pledge to work even harder. It's my work ethic, I think, is second to none. So thank you.
Well, did you want to say something else?
If I could
Go
just
right ahead.
add, I appreciated hearing the references from two of you about hope in the district. And I was just going to comment that every time I've had the opportunity to go into one of the schools or attend one of their special programs, and I look at our students, and they're the ones that give me the hope.
Yeah.
And, you know, here we are at 9 o'clock on a school night, and I think we've got a couple of students still in the audience. They haven't left. They're the hope for the future. And so, thank you. That's what I want to say thank you to all of them for giving us that hope, because I think that's why we sit here on the board.
100%, and even when you look at the civics presentations of our students, you know, I think people my age, it's really easy to criticize the youth, but they're pretty fantastic, and they're navigating a world that I'm not sure I could have navigated in my teen years with social media and everything that's going on in society. You've got to give them credit. And so, if you need any inspiration, go to an elementary school classroom, or a middle school classroom, or a high school classroom. These kids are going to change the world, and I'm optimistic.
You know, when you started out, the one statement you made to the board when we were interviewing you, and certainly when we hired you, is how you felt it was very important for you to stay in the classrooms, to stay in the buildings, because you needed to build relationships. And you wanted people to know you so that they trusted you and you trusted them, and you could rely on those relationships. And I remember one of our first building tours before the buildings opened up. And it started very organically with Trustee Trent on the selfies with Santana. And it grew into, you know, into something that is just, it's looked upon with great pride. And it's something that you continue today, and students look forward to it. And you know, it's something that's really, it's very heartwarming when people want to take a picture with the superintendent. And something else that you have taken great pride in is your Friday messages. That you give great thought to those messages, that you want to connect with our community, with our school community each and every week. So a couple of weeks ago, you wrote a message that really struck me with the beginning of the year. It was your New Year message, and I screenshot it, and I meant to say it at our last board meeting, but I didn't. So I think it's appropriate if I could read it now in my closing message for you tonight. And you said, this is just a snippet of what you said in the message. You said, "The new year is always a time of both reflection and planning ahead. Many people have remarked that they hope 2024 is a better year. Well, in response, all I can say is the best way to predict the future is to create it. Let's empower ourselves to do the best to make 2024 the best year yet. Let's focus on all the things that we are fortunate for and work on, and the things that need to be better. Let's not persevere on the things that are not in our control, but rather take ownership of our choices and on the impact we can make on a daily basis. We have more power than we might suspect. I'm looking forward to continuing my work in support of this great learning community. In the next couple of months, we will be starting our budget process, and here we are, and planning for the 2024-25 school year, and making it the best yet. You always go on to say how proud you are to work for this community, and we are proud to have you here. So again, congratulations.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
One quick thing, because I did step out and maybe I missed it, but Newsday's reporting that South Country is a recipient of an additional $252,000 in learning gap loss and mental health funding.
I think that's the RECOVES grant that we applied for. I haven't gotten official notification. I heard that too, but
Yeah, Newsday just updated it. Hempstead, Amityville, Freeport among 6 school districts sharing $100 million statewide. So 50 districts, $100 million across state. Does that sound like that's what that is?
it does. We applied for the learning loss one and the mental health one. I know we didn't get learning loss, so hopefully.
Yeah,
is
this
the announcement.
article from Newsday is $252,000. And as much as I criticize Newsday's reporting, I do happen to know this reporter and he's pretty good.
So I don't want to celebrate prematurely.
No, I don't either. I saw that and I just want to make sure I didn't miss it when I stepped out.
It's funny
So-
how they tell us we didn't get something, they don't tell us when we did get something.
So, just to give context to the trustees, we applied for 2 grants. One was the learning loss grant, which we were not given. The other was to address the mental health concerns. And so, yeah, and again, I touched upon it, we're always looking to increase revenue. This is one mechanism to do it. So that's
Yeah.
welcome news. Let's hope it's official.
With that, we need a motion to close. Motion by trustee Barry, seconded by trustee Trent. All those in favor? We stand adjourned.
Thank you.